Does anyone ever forget where they placed their keys?
No, never.
Where they parked their car? Now the next question is, are you worried about it? Are you worried about forgetting your keys? Worried about not finding your car? The answer is no, and you do not have subjective cognitive decline. However, if you are feeling like there's changes in your thinking abilities, your memory, any sort of cognitive ability, and you're worried about it, then you might fall into this category of believe something might be happening. There's a change. I'm forgetting more than normal, and I'm kind of worried about it. So that's what we're going to talk to you about today. Most of the work that we're presenting has all been done by Talia, so I will, she'll be telling you all the lovely things that she's found. But before I jump in, I do want to say the Indigenous affirmation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationships with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada. Call Ottawa home. And we acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. And just to make it a little bit more personal, I've included artwork that my aunt did. My aunt was very interested in Indigenous culture, and she learned how to do some engraving in wood, and she passed that on to us, an interest and understanding, better understanding. So just to make it a bit more personal. Certainly, none of what we're going to tell you about today was done even just with Talia and myself. We have a team. There's a couple of people in the School of Psychology who have helped us, Dr. Shanna Kuse and Dr. Vanessa Taller. We also have a collaborator, an engineer. Always good to have an engineer on your team. She helps a lot with the neuroimaging data and planning our studies. And then all these students. So a lot of them are interdisciplinary health science students, a couple of biomed. I have had one psychology student. And then we have a couple of people that didn't get tortured enough in my lab, so they stayed and they're doing graduate degree in my lab. So these are all people that are helping with subjective cognitive decline studies. I also have to thank the volunteers up front. We have wonderful older adults that come in for our studies and take their time, and they are very busy people. They take their time. This is one of our participants who agreed to have his picture shown. And most of our participants come from these three groups. So the National Association of Federal Retirees, the Council on Aging, and the Canadian Association of Retired People. Wonderful people. They volunteer every year in roles, and they're very helpful for the research. I always like to tell people before I jump in, why do I care? Why am I doing what I'm doing? I actually started doing work in social psychology, really did well, enjoyed it in my honors. But at the same time, my grandmother was sick. She had a fall and it completely changed the trajectory of her aging. In that picture, she's about 76, maybe 5 years later, she had the fall and later was diagnosed with dementia. And I lived through this with my grandmother. So it changed my whole career path to go, how can I prevent falls? How can I prevent cognitive aging? Maybe I can make a difference in identifying people earlier who might be at risk for these things and find some ways to prevent. So that's why I'm doing it. My dad also had dementia and just passed away last year. And that was another similar scenario, actually, where it was fall related and cognitive impairment related. So this is why I'm interested in this. Also myself, I'm well known for having injured my knee playing soccer. I have done some research on this now, and there's some research that shows that females have trouble dividing their attention when they're playing sports, and it often leads to ACL injuries. So maybe I'm protecting myself by doing this research. So this is why I'm into it, and this is why I'm sharing this with you today. So some good news, bad news to start out. There was a big study that went through all the literature that we could possibly think of and sort of looked at contributes to cognitive decline and what prevents it. So on this graphic, you can see up top are things in red, because red's evil, that increase the risk. In green, because this is helpful, that decrease the risk of cognitive decline. What's important, however, is the arrows. So the blue arrows are studies that we have tons of studies on, that we have a lot of evidence supporting this. Red arrows, we have moderate evidence for this. And then when you get into the green and yellow, there's lower evidence or there's not enough research in that area to fully say right now whether this is helpful or not helpful. So some of the things you might already know, diabetes, current smoking, midlife obesity, these are things that contribute to cognitive decline later in life. Things that are protective, more years of formal education, more physical activity. There's some evidence that the Mediterranean diet is helpful, and some forms of cognitive training are also helpful. I will add, because I do some research on support, that more research is coming out now about social networks and social support being very beneficial for your cognitive decline. This I wanted to show you too. This is sort of looking at cognitive function over time. So as people are aging, how things change. One of the main points I want to make on this slide is that most people are here, normal aging. And by the way, anyone that's 25 or close to that in the room, it starts at age 25 for a lot of the physiological processes. So things are going to change. This is normal. It's when it becomes pathological and a disease process that it's not normal. Most people are here, even in the 65 plus years range. They're normally aging. There are some changes. They have some aches and pains, but they're just normally aging. Kind of within the same category is what is now labeled subjective cognitive decline, or SCD. These are people that on most tests, they show up as normal aging as well. Except for that one thing, if you ask them, they're worried about their cognition and they think they're different from their peers, then they say they have subjective cognitive decline. It's usually by self-report. If you look at all the neuropsychological tests that you put them through, they look normal. They do not look like they have any cognitive decline. Despite this, some of those people, a percentage of those people, a small percentage, will actually go on to have cognitive declines. So there is some theory that some of these people are actually recognizing a subtle change in their abilities, and they're knowing this a lot earlier than it shows up on any tests. So there's some people now working towards this as maybe if we can identify the people who are really at risk and those who are maybe just in the worried well, they're fine. They are actually changing or cognitively declining. They're normal aging. And we can focus on those who are really at risk and try and do some prevention to maintain their health longer. Obviously, SCD is actually used as a marker for other impairments. So you'll get asked if you think you're worried about your memory or cognitive abilities and whether it's worse than people your age. And if you say yes, then that's a tick mark that leads you into the next category of possible mild cognitive impairment. There will be more tests to assess this and to assign you to that category. And then beyond that, when you have a diagnosis of dementia, that is when there's really pathology in the brain. So something has gone wrong. They can see pathology in the brain. It is a disease process, but until that point, it is still not a disease process. And most of our interventions are more beneficial at earlier stages than at a dementia stage, but you can still do things if someone is diagnosed with dementia. Just to make that point about most people are in the normal aging category. Only 1% of older adults that are between the ages of 65 and 69 that have a formal diagnosis of dementia. However, age is a non-modifiable risk factor. The older you get, yes, your chances will increase of having some form of dementia. So 1 in 4 people over the age of 85 will have some dementia. How do I look at this? Well, you might have heard me say at the beginning, my grandmother fell, mother fell, I hurt my knee playing soccer. So what I got interested in was multitasking. So people doing something motor and cognitive at the same time. And it is in these circumstances that I assess people and look at, one, how they're performing. So if I ask them to do finger tapping or walking alone, how fast do they walk? How fast do they tap? And then if I ask them to repeat a bunch of numbers back to me or say some animal names to me, how do they do on that? How fast are they? How many words do they produce? And then if I ask them to do the two at the same time, how do they do? And how does their performance change from when they were doing it? That gives me an idea of how they're managing cognitive demands. And it's a good way to look at if somebody's changing in their abilities. They were able to do the two things much more efficiently, perhaps at a younger age, and now it's getting a bit more difficult. And are the people who are at risk finding it really more difficult? Is there older adults that perform at the same level as younger adults? Don't get me wrong, I've done this testing before, but there are some older adults who significantly slow their walking. They maintain their responding, but they walk a lot slower to be able to do it. Those are people that are more likely to be at risk than those who are able to maintain walk speed while they're responding. This is what Talia is going to tell you mostly about this, but this is what we're going to go through with you today. A few studies that we've done that are all along this line. This is relatively new for us. I've mostly done research with cognitively healthy people or mild cognitive impairment. So this is where we were sort of delving into, is it worth jumping into this area of subjective cognitive decline, functional near-infrared spectroscopy, which I think you should try and say 5 times fast, see if you can do it. We say FNIRS because it's much easier. We wanted to see like what's been done in FNIRS. So Talia will tell you a little bit about a literature review where we're really focused on how many people have looked at dual tasks and if this helps differentiate people SCD from normal aging, not. I'll tell you a little bit about a pilot study. So again, go back to my honor students who are fantastic. Did a little pilot study just to see. We asked people, are there any differences between people who are saying they have a problem, who are saying they don't? We actually had a look at people who actually said SCD, they have an issue and they're worse than their peers, and those who said, no, I'm fine. Like, yeah, sometimes I forget my keys, but I'm fine. I'm not different than anyone else my age. What we found was interesting. We just asked them on this everyday cognition scale, what areas they felt there were differences in. The areas are in red, that there are significant differences between our people who are SCD and non-SCD. This gave us a little bit of interest because last one here, divided attention, another word for dual tasking. People did really feel like their divided attention abilities and ability to walk and talk had changed with age and that they were different. So we're like, maybe it's good to actually test them in a dual task. So this is what we're doing, and this is what we're sharing with you today. These are again 2 of our participants. A little hard to see, but this lady is wearing a band on her head with optodes that measures FNIRS. It's called an FNIRS device, sorry. It measures changes of cerebral oxygenation in the brain. So as blood flow goes to an area, the light penetrates the brain and it reflects back and we're able to get a sort of measure of how much change in oxygenation is in that. It's always comparative. It's always a condition that's baseline. You're ideally doing nothing compared to where you're doing something in an experiment and seeing what are the changes between baseline. This is EEG for electroencephalogy, and this is measuring electrical activity. Talia wanted to extend her PhD. She's done a lot of work in FNIRS and just see, okay, now if we're not looking at the cerebral oxygenation, but we're looking at the electrical activity of the brain, do we find similar things to what we found with FNIRS? This is what we're sort of looking at. So an article that Jason's on actually by Cabeza et al. Where we're sort of interested in how much people are ramping up their neural demands. So if we're talking about oxygenation, are they increasing their oxygenation to manage the dual task demands? And so our expectation is if there is a subtle change, the people who have SCD might actually be working harder, doing the same task as the people who don't report any changes. So we might actually see a sort of uptake with SCD, their activity, and less activity. Somebody's brain's working more efficiently who doesn't have any changes in the brain. That was sort of our expectation starting out. And basically, these are the reasons why we wanted to do it, ideally to increase treatment options. We'll tell you at the end, we're doing a randomized control trial, provides a whole bunch of interventions that are on the modifiable risk factors to try and improve cognitive health. We're hoping like maybe we can do this earlier. Right now, we're offering it to people with mild cognitive decline, mild cognitive. Maybe we can offer it earlier and see if we can reverse or delay cognitive decline, give older adults what they want to age in place, maintain their functional abilities as much as possible. And me, I'm interested in the safety factor too, because falls and cognition are intimately linked. So if you have better cognition, less likely to fall. This also might help us differentiate from other categories like mild cognitive dementia. So I'm going to leave to you. This is you. I'm going to pass the floor to Talia. She's going to tell you about research that she's done.
Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit more about what we've learned over time, things that we've done as part of our studies as part of that. First, we started with the literature. I'll talk a little bit more about each point specifically in the slides, but essentially we started just looking into asking on subjective cognitive decline. Dual tasking is something that we've done with older adults and younger adults, but never really with, but it has also been done. Then taking the knowledge from the literature review, we did a pilot study, main purpose being to see what kinds of different tasks used as part of the task. So task is like cognitive and component. So just seeing what motor tasks are, or what the literature findings were, as well as neuroimaging. Can we use neuroimaging in people with cognitive effect to see any differences between people with and without? And then once we got the results from the pilot study, we kind of expanded the study. So we increased the scale, created more, continued to use areas, but then motor tasks initially, then took into consideration cognitive tasks. Often people with have cognitive complaints and different cognitive abilities. So that aspect, as well as incorporating neuroimaging, there's some using FNIRS as well as other imaging modalities. Then lastly, Dr. Fraser mentioned just talking a little bit randomized control trial that we have right now that will also different modifiable risk factors. Starting off with the literature review, which actually came out to be a systematic review. So essentially what we were looking for is whether dual task outcomes identify differences within and between also controls. If you look at the screen here. So if you think of cognitive continuum, you have non-SCDs. These are people or controls, older adults who don't complain of anything related to their cognition. They're saying they're aging normal. Then we have SCD, as Fraser mentioned, people who think that their physical memory is worse than it used to be. It's majorly. Then we have like objective state of cognitive. You can objectively measure this on a test, for example. This would be mild cognitive. So what we were looking for in the systematic review, a little bit background about search criteria. We were looking for any type of study that looked at a dual task, so doing simultaneously be cognitive, for example. And then we looked for it to be compared either within an SCD groups, or comparing SCD with the other groups. Well, what we found is that task performance was worse than single task performance within the SCD group. And this was expected, and this is what we see both younger adults and older adults in people at different stages of cognitive, that doing something more cognitively dependent or decrease your performance. And I'll just this figure here showing that walking speed, for example, was in the MCI group compared with well. So this comparison is important to know because it's a speed which is considered like non-objective compared to CI when people are ready. And the main finding for the study when we were useful and the motor component walking because of the relationship. That's why walking speed. Then what we found in terms of neuroimaging is that there wasn't enough data to pull anything together. Meta-analysis type of it. But essentially there were a few studies that looked at MRI, to see single dual tasks and within groups that there was increased brain activity group between dual task and single task, but also for example. Then seeing this information, we conducted our pilot study. So because the systematic review, we found the walking component of the dual task. So we also wanted to component that we did. So like on a keyword. The reason being, they find motor dexterity is also important with aging, but also considering like quality and logistics, ever to be transferred, for example, and it would be better space constraint. And then can we use neuroimaging for that? So although our literature review a ton of studies looking at 5 years in the past with older adults, it's between cognitive decline, then we have 20 older adults, so some with CD, some without. The way we define that generally done by asking, the question is usually, are you concerned? We found it important to also ask about your attention, language abilities, domains, because of firstly the previous studies which show that people subjectively interest in these, and also that subjective isn't necessarily or isn't to just. Some of the results from this, so and what we found is actually greater brain activity compared during the typing task. So what we had people sit just typing on or alternating back and doing back task. I'll talk a bit more. The change in brain activity. So again, it's a change or greater change cerebral compared to. But interestingly, when you look at their objective performance on something like the assessment, both groups perform similarly. It comes out super clear, right? 27. So still performing objectively well, and there wasn't. That's why it was interesting to then back to the idea where these groups differ in terms of which they activate their brains to perform literally same level on an objective. To increase the scale now, So now that we had some idea of what the motor task would work. Okay, so basically we doubled the sample size. We continued with the same neuroimaging, so FNIRS. But now given what we know about people's perceptions about their cognition, we were interested to see what would happen if we use different types of cognitive tasks. Is the volume better now, or? Okay. So here's a image of one of our participants. So I'll explain more what the tasks are now. So starting with the first one we did was an NBAC task. So we had participants sit in front of the computer. They were typing by alternating pressing 2 keys on the keyboard with their pointer and middle fingers. This one was auditory in the sense that the participants in their headphones, you can see our participant wearing the headphone there, were hearing a sequence of numbers. So it was single digits, for example, the numbers like 4 to 7. As soon as they heard the second number, they would say the number they had previously heard 2 numbers back. And then we did a second cognitive task, which is what is shown here. This one's called a double number sequence task. And what people did in this one rather than being auditory was visual. So the participant would look at the screen. There would be a sequence of 3-digit numbers that would be displayed. We would give them 2 target numbers that they had to, single-digit target numbers that they had to count within the sequence. And then at the very end, we would ask them how many times they counted each number. So if you can imagine doing this yourself, it's quite challenging, especially when we have them do a second thing like typing at the same time.
Yeah, number 2 is torturous. I failed my own test on that one.
So what we found from this is greater dual task brain activity in the SCD group compared to the non-SCD group. So this is what we see here. So again, the change in brain activity on the y-axis, and the x-axis, we have our SCD and non-SCD group. So only during the finger tapping task, not during the NBAC task, we saw that there was differences in brain activity. But again, performance was similar between the groups, and performance ranged from things like people's react or response time, so their time to respond just for the NBAC task, but also their typing speed, the variability in their typing, whether or not they're pressing the right keys, that sort of thing. So knowing that, we then moved on to using a different type of neuroimaging. As I mentioned earlier, there's pros and cons to different types of neuroimaging. What this one gave to us that FNIRS didn't. FNIRS, we just measure the participant's prefrontal cortex, whereas with EEG, we have the opportunity to look at the entire brain. As Dr. Fraser mentioned, FNIRS measures changes in cerebral oxygenation, whereas EEG can measure electrical activity. So from the literature, we know there's an association between the P3 ERP and executive function and attention, which is exactly what's being tested with dual tasks. The P3 is generally detected along midline electrodes. So this is like a figure of kind of our setup for our EEG. So along the midline is generally where the P3 originates from, as well as from the central and parietal regions. The ones we looked at specifically were central, which is what you could see here in blue, as well as in pink, we looked at frontal because that's what we did for the FNIRS. And we know that there's increased oxygenation in that area. So we want to see as well if there would be electrical activity. And what we know from the literature in terms of what has been done with SCD and EEG is that P3 amplitude was attenuated in the SCD group compared to the non-SCD group. So what this means is that when you look at, for example, the amplitude or how high like the peak is of electrical activity, the SCD group was lower compared to the non-SCD group. And then P3 amplitude was also greater and latency was longer in older adults with cognitive complaints. So in this study, that's what they called the SCD group, but it's essentially the same. And this was during a Simon task. So just to go back to like the second point here, this one was during a go-no-go task. And this one was during a Simon task. And then what we had participants do is we continued with our double number sequence task that we did with FNIRS. We had them again sitting in front of the computer typing. So they did just the numbers. They did another condition where they did just typing, and then they do both at the same time. And then we compare the single conditions to the dual condition. So these are some preliminary analyses for EEG, emphasis on the preliminary. So what you could see in the figures here on the top is the frontal ROI, I guess I can call it. It's just the group of the 5 electrodes in the frontal region versus the central region, like I showed on the previous slide. You could see the black line and the red line are for the dual task conditions, and the blue and green line are for the single task conditions. And then it differs based on whether it's the non-SCD group or the SCD group. So what we found is greater amplitude during the single compared to dual tasks in both the frontal and central regions, as well as longer latency, so where like the peak is relative to the other group or condition, during dual compared to single tasks, again in the frontal and central regions. But there was no differences in amplitude or latency between the SCD and non-SCD groups. So these findings are when we group all the people together that we found that there's single and dual differences, like we see with older adults without cognitive complaints, like we see in younger adults as well. So the significance of this, I don't know if you want to jump back in.
So, as you can see from what Talia has told you, we have a little bit of evidence. Do we have a lot of evidence? No. Some of these people, they're different participants in studies. So did we have some people maybe in the first study who really are identifying some changes? And in the second study, we had the worried well that are fine, and therefore there are no differences. The technique is capturing something different than the other technique captured. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So we're hopeful still. We're gonna still continue down this path. Some of the changes that we made were to make the task a little bit more challenging because older adults can handle a lot. And on most tasks that I give them in the lab, they perform similarly to younger adults. That's why we always increase the difficulty, because you have to have sort of this challenging dual task to really capture differences. So we're hoping in the future studies, we can look at this a little bit more long-term. How does this evolve over time? Is there maybe if we follow them over time, will we see changes over time in those who are really worried and really at risk, and other people will not change over time? So that would be another way of looking at it. We do want a more varied sample. I love my 3 groups that I recruit from, but these are highly educated white people who have a lot of money. So we need to vary our sample and look more at what's going on in a more varied sample, because I don't know what it would look like in a different sample. And then this is sort of my little offshoot, because I do a lot of work on stigma and stereotypes about aging. I wonder about the intersection between those two things. Are a lot of people out there just worried about their memory because they keep hearing about dementia in the news every day of the week and how terrible it is and how people are suffering? That word, I hate that word. Suffering, suffering, suffering. If you haven't heard it a million times in association with dementia, you haven't been reading the news. But that's a curiosity I have too, is are people presenting this way because they've heard, yeah, this is likely to happen to you, so maybe you should be worried about your memory, and maybe it's creating some people that are actually worried well. We are doing some work, and that's what we'll tell you about next, to have some interventions and follow the interventions to see how we are actually helping people maintain their cognitive health. This is some of the stuff that we're going to continue on in our lab. So one way to make it more difficult is to make the motor task more difficult. We do have stairs in the lab. I have done studies looking at people's brain activity while they're walking on stairs. So that might be one of my master's students is going to do work on stairs and look more closely at verbal fluency, which from a lot of the psychological literature, verbal fluency is an area that tends to differentiate people from SCD and non-SCD. So maybe if we give them this challenging cognitive task and the challenging stairs, we'll see some differences in the brain activity. And lastly, did you want to talk about the intervention?
So just the last point here is that what we've learned from our studies, which are for the stages before there's any objective cognitive declines, we're also part of a randomized control trial that's looking at interventions for people who have mild cognitive impairment, so are already demonstrating objective cognitive impairments. So what our main criteria, we asked the participant if they're feeling forgetful, And then if they are, we'll pre-screen them and then eventually screen them. But you want to click yeah, so it's a Canada-wide study. The protocol is published. We also did a systematic review meta-analysis about different types of modifiable risk factors and also the benefits of doing multiple component interventions as opposed to just looking at one factor, so doing multiple things simultaneously. So as I mentioned, this is taking place at 8 other universities in Canada. It takes place entirely online, so the participant can realistically do it from anywhere as long as they have internet connection.
Can I add? I'm gonna add, we did do this in person before COVID. And we were looking at what, if we pair a couple of things, does that help more? So we did find, in terms of a psychological measure on the ADAS-COG, which is a measure of your dementia status, that we were able to reduce that by a standard deviation for people who did a paired, so they did cognitive training as well as exercise training, aerobic training. And that was better than just doing exercise alone or doing cognitive training alone. And we had other conditions like vitamin D and other things too that are modifiable risk factors. But so we had good evidence from the first randomized control trial. COVID hit, we put everything online. I will say that our participants don't like it as much online, so I don't know how that's going to go. But it's the same intervention, but delivered through a virtual platform.
Yeah, so these are just some of well, there's 2 groups as part of the intervention. We have like the active intervention group and then what we call like the education group. So if they're randomized into the intervention group, they receive bi-weekly coaching like on Zoom. So they get help designing a physical exercise program that's mainly composed 40 minutes of aerobic exercise, 20 minutes of resistance training. If they're already physically active, that can be incorporated in. That's 3 times a week for an hour. And then they also participate in cognitive training. So this is 3 times a week for 30 minutes using our online platform. And if you could think back to what was presented at the very beginning of the presentation and just in terms of the level of evidence we have for each of these types of intervention components, as well, the participant will receive advice about their diet and sleep habits. And if they have any vascular risk factors like high blood pressure, for example, they'll also receive advice on how to monitor and manage that. And then that's compared to the education group. So rather than meeting with a coach bi-weekly, it's more self-directed. So it's up to them. They're going to learn about these same 5 factors in addition to a bonus 6th factor, which is the benefits of social engagement. So they'll learn about these same 6 components, but it'll be more up to them how or if they want to implement it into their daily life. Yeah, so
that's our story. So does anyone have any questions? We open the floor.
Questions, questions dans les 2 langues, que ce soit français ou anglais. To our online participants, I would just say, feel free to put up your hand if you would like to speak and ask your question yourself, but you can also use the chat and we will be monitoring the chat as well if you're more comfortable that way. So we are ready to take any question.
Ready for you.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much. So it's I've got more of a general question about subjective cognitive decline. Because I wonder about just the individual differences in it. And so what puts somebody in a position where they can notice their own cognitive decline? Like if somebody's playing bridge, for instance, requires so much memory and attention, they may notice something more so than somebody who does less cognitively engaging tasks. So is there any way to control for that? Because once those 2 different people say, I noticed something, their objective cognitive decline might be better.
yes. Oh, you can go.
There is some evidence. So there's evidence that people that are usually right are more highly educated. So it's people who are actually quite engaged in things and they notice a subtle change and are able to express this maybe settings. So I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. There should be more. There is.
Yeah, I was gonna say-
There's a suggested.
Yeah, so there's also what they call, it's like newer, the SCD plus factors. So it's about 7 different items that help to characterize people more so than just, are you feeling like your memory is getting worse? And these things are like, are you feel like your memory is getting worse compared to other people the same age as you? Or have you noticed these declines in the past 5 years or 10 years? Questions like that can help to characterize people. Are there any objective impairments? Is there a cognitive complaint? What is the cognitive complaint? That sort of thing. What age you started feeling like your memory was declining? And then I guess the flip side, which I think also might help answer your question, is, for example, people with depression are more likely to report cognitive complaints than, say, someone who isn't depressed. So that's something we try to control for, but with a depression scale. But that's also in the literature that can have an effect on subjective cognitive decline.
In the US, it's rather normal for a primary physician to ask a series of questions that are relevant to what you're doing. I've always wondered, where does that go? Probably nowhere other than into the doctor's notes. And if they find new evidence or different evidence from visit to visit, assuming they even do any comparison at all, maybe then something happens. But I'm wondering if that would be one way for you to get a larger population to study, if there was a way for people to say, perhaps you're interested in, an evaluation. And certainly the fact that they're going to a primary care physician might automatically give you a larger population.
That's a great idea. I will say that a lot of people are afraid to be found out as something has changed. Many don't want to know. There's some people that we have, very rare, but there's people that we have seen that we're sort of worried because of a cluster of factors that we've seen in our tests. Encourage them to go see their primary care physician.
Right, the other way, yeah.
They're like, oh, I don't want to lose my license. But the US has done a great job of collecting data on it, because they have a huge infographic on how many people are reporting this. It's quite high in the US. So,
And I just wanted to add to that too. One of the SCD plus factors is whether or not you've consulted a primary care provider about your cognition.
yeah.
So we tried to ask those questions as part of our study. We have that as part of the screening process, how people answered those questions. So that can also help us characterize people.
Another study. Yes.
Do you think, how do you think the results would be if you had a more varied sample, considering that you have a lot of language abilities in the.
Yeah. So the question was, how do you think it would be different with a more diversified sample? That's an excellent question. I honestly, I don't know. We would have to look at, there's many factors that go into somebody's brain activity, and there's some strengths in different groups in the population that are seen when you put them in these situations. So I honestly don't know. We haven't done enough. We haven't had diverse enough samples in our lab.
But also just based on what you were talking about at the beginning of the presentation too, for example, if someone is less educated, that has a lot of other factors that are associated with that, less access to healthcare, things like that. So
Stressors potentially.
Yeah.
This might have more stressors that might actually come out as higher dual thought, they might be more stressed in a dual thought.
So if I had to hypothesize about it, I would assume they would probably be more worse off than highly educated people, using that as an example. Yeah.
I can say that when I first read the title for your program, which obviously got me here, I was interested in part because as my area is law, but one of my concerns and one of my research concerns is always about people with executive function decreases, particularly if it's not combined with obvious memory problems that would get them an earlier diagnosis. Because so much of the time that's about inability to recognize risk, inability to use appropriate judgment. And they have great memories, but you are now distrusting trusting people that are the wrong people. And so when I saw, are you at greater risk? I was thinking at greater risk of what? So, and it was interesting to see that you're really saying at greater risk of through cognitive impairment.
Also interesting that mention that too, because when we're looking at executive functions in terms of like what I'm doing in human kinetics, like motor control, just when people are walking, we're looking at like their what processes are automatic. So when people have to divide their attention, for example, an older adult walking on stairs, often if you're like, or not necessarily an older person, but let's say you're just walking on stairs with someone having a conversation, oftentimes someone will stop walking to talk or stop talking to walk. So it's being able to, like you're saying, be able to assess, do I need to stop walking now? And that ability changes over time.